Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Dalibor Rohac and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my friend
Yulia Zhozha with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities.
Our colleague Giselle Donnelly from AEI is having technical difficulties, but she might crash halfway through the show, so brace yourselves for that. On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace and security that have erupted along a line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. Our special guest today is Scott Cullinane, Senior Government Relations Advisor at RASM for Ukraine. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. Scott, if I may, I would like to start on a somewhat personal note. So we've known each other for a better part of the past decade. I first met you as a very energetic Hill staffer working on transatlantic relations. From Capitol Hill, you've moved on to help build various organizations, advise organizations that are working in the transatlantic space, making the case for why Europe matters to the United States. And now you are working with RASM for Ukraine, which is a US-based charity, NGO founded in the aftermath of the Revolution of Dignity by Ukrainian expats, if I understand it correctly, and in America, with the ambition of helping Ukraine become a flourishing and prosperous liberal democracy embedded in the international system. So perhaps we could start by you telling us a little bit about how that career trajectory makes sense from your perspective, and what your current work with RASM entails, and what RASM does in broader terms.
Well, thank you so much, Dalibor. It's really an honor and a treat for me to be here today. So thank you for having me on. As you said, I've had a great almost 15 years in Washington, D.C., working for many years on Capitol Hill for the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And that was a wonderful experience. And I had the pleasure of helping to cover the Europe and Eurasia portfolio for a couple of years. And when I left the Hill, I knew I wanted to stay working in the transatlantic space. And Europe was really a place that captured my interest, captured my heart, and a place I think is very important for the future of American security and American prosperity. And earlier this year, I began working with a fantastic organization called RASM for Ukraine, and RASM meaning together in Ukrainian. And this is an organization which was founded in 2014, so it's been around for a couple years, based in New York, but has really gone through an incredible change over the past 18 months. And that all began in February of last year with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And in short, what happened was there was a huge need to help the people of Ukraine respond to Russia's aggression, to Putin's aggression. And over that time, RASM has grown significantly. In fact, RASM has raised well over $85 million, mostly from small donors, about 170,000 small dollar donors from all over the U.S. And the vast majority of that has gone for medical relief, for grants to support grassroots NGOs in Ukraine, generators, warm winter clothing, a whole host of things like that. And together with that humanitarian and emergency response work, in April of last year, so just a little over a year ago, maybe approaching a year and a half ago now, RASM decided to also open an office in Washington, D.C. to have a presence in the U.S. Capitol to do advocacy, to talk about why Ukraine's victory is important, and to educate the American public, to educate policymakers, and to have a voice, a Ukrainian American voice in Washington, pushing and talking about how the U.S. can and should help Ukraine, and how that relates to America's own prosperity and security. And so the vast majority of what RASM does is focused on Ukraine. We have an office in Kyiv. We have a warehouse there that delivers supplies of all kinds, responding to the needs on the ground. The small portion of RASM I work in is focused on advocacy. And so I spend much of my time talking to people on Capitol Hill and working with my colleagues who deal with talking to the press or who work with community groups all across the U.S. who want to rally support for the Ukrainian cause. And so I feel incredibly lucky to be working with a great organization and to be working on Ukraine, which I think I can say for those of us who are involved in transatlantic relations and who care about foreign policy, Ukraine is the issue. It is the issue of the moment. It's the overriding challenge of our time. And I'm so honored to be able to hopefully contribute in some small way to helping make that better and to helping Ukraine survive and come out of this horrible experience, better if that's possible.
Well, thank you for that, and I'm heartened to hear that, because it's great to hear that others feel the same way we do on the Eastern Front podcast, that it's a privilege and an honor to be working in and for Ukraine in one way or another, and trying to chip in and making a difference here. And so I know we are planning, and I'll get to that in a second, talking about the Hill here and how your work is going. And maybe one way to ease into that is to look at the transatlantic relations overall, kind of also from the perspective from Congress here, because we've heard and we talked on this podcast a lot over the last few months about the voices that are increasing and will increase on the Hill, saying that Europeans aren't doing enough and that they should be more responsible for their own security, and they should take leadership even when it comes to Ukraine. And I believe just today, September 7th, we have data coming out that shows that now EU plus UK and Norway have offered more aid, military aid to Ukraine than the United States. And data is also coming out today for the first time that the United States is not anymore in the top 10 when it comes to aid overall for Ukraine in comparison to the GDP. And so if you are, I'm sure you will use this data too, and your talking points on the Hill, but if you are to look back over the last few months and into into the data today, where does that leave us in the conversation that we're having, particularly in Congress, about how transatlantic relations are going from both sides of the aisle, from the Democrats and from the Republicans? Is that actually helping, or are we so overwhelmed, particularly on the GOP side, by populism that actual data is not going to help the cause of transatlantic security?
Big question. And I saw that data as well, and it definitely helps. Taking a slightly longer perspective, I would say there's always been complaints on Capitol Hill about Europe, about the EU, about transatlanticism, probably going back decades. I'm not sure there's ever been a time when there's been no complaints. It's sort of one of those things that is always there in some form. So that's not terribly new. And I've made the point before, and I've made it for several years now, that sometimes on Capitol Hill there are those voices that respond to actual problems, and there are those voices that maybe be well-meaning but respond to problems that they imagine or think exist, or to impressions. So there's always been a very mixed conversation on Capitol Hill about Europe. But I think it is fair to say that in general there has been a push for Europe to do more, and usually you hear that solidified around the NATO 2% benchmark. And certainly, I think in recent years, as more of the U.S. geopolitical focus has moved to the Indo-Pacific, there's also been increasing calls for Europe and the EU to do more to help the U.S. In that sector. And here I point to export controls on say, microchips as an example, where there's been calls for Europe and the U.S. to be more aligned on those policy areas. When it comes to Ukraine, I think the data is actually pretty good in terms of Europe is stepping up to not only take in refugees and displaced persons from Ukraine, but stepping up on economic support and stepping up on weapons, which, there's always things that can be done better, and that's true for the U.S. It's true for Europe. But I think in general, Europe has come a long way. And you remember back to early last year when Germany, I think, was going to send helmets. Some of the starting points, of this conversation from early last year, the bar was pretty darn low, and there's still room to improve. But looking at what Europe has done, stepping up on air defense, stepping up on F-16s, there's a lot of things there that I think European governments and countries can be very proud of. And it's certainly something that we point to very often, because I think there is a sense in some quarters of Capitol Hill that the U.S. is going it alone, that it's only the U.S. helping Ukraine. And that's certainly not the case. And so we point to that quite often to show that it's not just an American effort or an American project, but this is really a transatlantic project to push back on Russia's aggression and to see that Ukraine achieves victory. It's something that we all have an interest in. And I think the data and the examples very clearly bear that out.
So many interesting sort of threads in what you put on the table. We certainly struggle on the podcast, and it's a perennial conversation we'll have probably until the war is over, whether the glass is half full or half empty, especially when it comes to Europe's role. Your points are well taken. At the same time, countries that keep buying Russian oil, there hasn't been that much that has come out of the Zeitenwende thus far. It's true that Europe starts from a very low base. There are some sort of objective constraints that can't just be wished away. Like, to my mind, that's sort of very much an open question of whether we see Europe as doing not enough or just enough. But one thing I want to sort of focus on for a few minutes is this question of politics, which is distinct from this sort of substantive conversation we can have about Europeans doing enough or not enough. So you could make the argument that some years ago politics would stop at the water's edge, that an issue like Ukraine would be an issue that would command a high level of bipartisan support, and there would be a sense of committee and unity in the political class, and that still exists to some extent, but to a much lesser extent than before. And one thing that I believe has happened is that Ukraine has become one of those sort of cultural political markers for partisanship in certain quarters, in a way that's impervious to any kind of substantive arguments you might want to make. And my question to you, I suppose, is, if that's the situation, and if it's harder to sustain Ukraine as a bipartisan issue, then why doesn't the administration and the Democrats in Congress just treat it as a partisan issue and try to, make as good a job at it as they can, having in mind that they'll face an election, several elections next year? It would be in President Biden's political interest, I would imagine, that Ukraine wins, that it retakes its territory by November 2nd or 3rd next year, and yet he is not acting accordingly, and I don't see the same degree of sort of urgency among congressional Democrats. Do you have an explanation for that political puzzle?
Yes, it is certainly one of our greatest priorities at ROSM to see Ukraine to continue to be a bipartisan interest. It is in the national interest of the U.S. to see Ukraine win, and we very much believe that, and that's at the core of what we do. I'd say from my personal experience, I began to see Ukraine-Russia policy kind of seep into domestic politics, obviously, during the Trump years. This is really, because not only we had the famous Helsinki press conference that eventually led to Trump's first impeachment. And I saw on the Hill where before Russia-Ukraine policy really was not a good indicator of a partisan stance. If you just told me someone's thoughts on Russia, it'd be very hard to tell if they were Republican or Democrat. But then over the course of the last administration, in the last 5 years or so, that began to change. And what you thought about Zelensky or Putin or Russia or Ukraine began to be sort of a stand-in for where you stood on other things, like Trump or the impeachment or your partisan standing. And that slide isn't complete, but we're beginning to to go in that direction. And so we're very much pushing to have members of Congress, to have media, to have the public understand, talk about, and view Ukraine through the lens of national policy and not partisanship. But that's very difficult. And that remains difficult for several reasons. And probably first and foremost is that Donald Trump, who still remains an incredibly popular figure in the Republican Party, continues to take a drastically different perspective on the conflict, as well as the fact that the two, if not three, leading candidates in the Republican primary continue to take difficult views on Ukraine. And even though a number of candidates, Pence, Nikki, Chris Christie, have very good views on Ukraine, but they're unfortunately not leading the polls. And what I think is going to happen over the coming months is it's very hard for members of Congress to break with the leading candidate or candidates to be their party's nominee for the White House. And so there is sort of a pull there, a center of gravity that will pull members of Congress in that direction.
Do you think things will actually get worse in the coming months on the Republican side?
Well, I certainly hope not. And I'm still somewhat optimistic because I think in general, most voters, most Republicans are directionally pro-Ukraine. Putin is very unpopular. Zelensky is very popular. Ukraine, most people I think know at their gut level, Ukraine is the victim. Russia is committing genocide. Russia is doing incredibly cruel and gruesome things, like the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. That's not very popular. I think at their gut level, most people know that's not what America is about, and we don't want, to condone that. In fact, we want very much to help the victims defend themselves and to retake what is rightfully theirs. So I think both at the public level, at the level of voters, and member of Congress, most people, including most Republicans, are for Ukraine. They're in Ukraine's corner. And I think that's true from the polling data. I think that's also true just from the conversations I have on Capitol Hill. So I think that the basic fundamentals of the conversation work very well for Ukraine and not so well for Putin. But that gets a little bit complicated because you do have these kind of cross-cutting trends. And unfortunately, there is a challenge of there are information bubbles inside the electorate and even inside our political elites, where unfortunately true information doesn't always penetrate, and sometimes conspiracy theories come out, or things that are half true or things that really aren't that important become really, really inflated. And so sometimes there can be these unfortunate misunderstandings or confusions, or people choose to fixate on certain things. And certainly I would say it's a thing where we encourage members of Congress, and even if there is some pushback in terms of on social media, or maybe there's a segment on Tucker Carlson, and that then produces some angry phone calls to a member of Congress. Certainly our advocacy is to those offices, to those members, is to stay focused on helping Ukraine achieve victory, and that a few loud voices is not indicative or representative of the majority of people and the majority of voters, including in the Republican Party, who don't want to see Vladimir Putin have a victory. Because I think it's not a hard case to make that we are seeing this alliance and these elements of cooperation between Russia and Iran. Drone technology being an obvious one. Cooperation between North Korea and Russia on ammunition. Cooperation between Russia and China. All of the authoritarian governments that oppose the U.S., that harm our national interests, they all see a convergence, and their interests are served if Putin wins. They all want to see Ukraine lose. And even if you're not sure about Ukraine or you don't know all the details, I think even just seeing that, who is on Putin's side? Tehran, Beijing, Pyongyang, these are not our friends. And if they want Putin to win, that should be a clue to us that we probably want the opposite to happen. So in general, it's a long answer, but to come back to your point, there is an element of the potential for this to become a partisan issue, but I think that would be very unfortunate, and it certainly wouldn't serve the U.S. national interest, and it certainly wouldn't help Ukraine.
Yeah, you don't need to do any convincing on our side. Our audience is fully on board with that. But I want to ask you a little bit about the polls, because particularly about the CNN or the poll for CNN, the survey for CNN for the summer, because that really sent shivers down the spine of many, especially directly on the Eastern Front, but across Europe too. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm looking now at an article that was that is quoting that from The Hill a few days ago, saying 71% of Republicans are opposing additional funding for Ukraine. And I think it's worth separating here or trying to make sense of the additional funding, how that is being politicized in itself, to what extent these numbers and from poll to poll, from survey to survey, lower numbers in support on either side, but particularly on the GOP side, are not helping the cause, and whether that's nudging into the same direction that Dalibor was asking about earlier, if through propaganda from outside, from Russia's allies in Russia directly, or through political elites in the GOP manipulating with their statements, we shouldn't be worrying about a downward trend of popular support on the Republican side in the months to come, building up to the election.
So polls can be a tricky thing, and especially in foreign policy. I think what we've seen in general is that most people, even if they were following the war closely during sort of the height of the invasion last February and last March, most people are not following the news that closely. And I think in general, most people don't have very fixed views on foreign policy. And when it comes to polling about Ukraine, what I've seen is that those levels of support move quite a bit when you add context. And when you add in the context of for the equivalent of 3% of our annual Defense Department budget, we have helped Ukraine destroy something on the order of 50% of the capacity of the Russian land army? Or do you know, with this support, Ukraine has been able to recapture, I'll make up a number, but say 60% of the territory that Russia initially claimed earlier last year? And when you add in context, we see voters of all stripes, including Republican voters, become much more in favor. And I can also add there, when you add in the context of the U.S. not going alone, but if you ask that same question and said, did you know that European governments are spending as much, if not more, than the U.S. to support Ukraine, then what do you think? And when you add context and add information, those numbers move quite dramatically. And the other element to add in there to understand is that even of people who have firm views on Ukraine, the number of voters who say Ukraine is an issue in which they are going to decide their vote on remains very low. And so even if there is an element of the Republican base that is very firm in opposing Ukraine, they say issues like the economy or healthcare or immigration are far more important to them, and that's actually what they're deciding their vote on, not on Ukraine. So, I take your point on the polls, but I think when you add context, it's not nearly as dramatic or as dire as maybe some of those headlines make it appear as.
So actually, my original framing, I suppose, was somewhat more subversive than the question that Julia asked, in the sense that I have sort of taken as a given that there is this sort of dynamic on the Republican right, which we might try to reverse, and you're doing a great job, trying to reverse. But let's just assume that it sort of drifts in that direction, and then the question is for the president and for the Democratic part of the two legislative chambers to act accordingly. And your point about opinion polls is well taken. I think support for Ukraine has sort of ebbed and flowed, and I think as a general pattern, people like winners. Whenever there are successes on the battlefield, it energizes the support for Ukraine. When it feels like weeks and months have gone on and nothing happened on the battlefield, people sort of get tired and want to move on. That's a very common pattern. So to me, I mean, the politically rational thing for President Biden and Democrats in Congress to do is to go big. They can say to the Republicans, okay, you want to side with Putin? Be our guests, and now we are going to rhetorically make the case for why Ukraine matters, but more importantly, we are going to throw everything at the problem. There are thousands of Abrams tanks rotting somewhere in storage. There are F-16s that are not going to be used for anything. There are things that I think Democrats and the administration could do that they are not currently doing. They could pass additional aid packages, maybe with narrower margins of support. But those additional aid packages would still get through Congress, and then by November next year, the president could say, look, I've delivered a Ukrainian victory. Ukraine is in control of its territory, and I think that would be a great thing to sell to the American people, as opposed to a situation in which the war is kind of inconclusive by November next year. He will have spent, $100-something billion and basically handed Republicans a stick to hit him over the head with. Does that make sense?
It does, and I fully agree. And I would say, first, speaking of the administration, I think the first thing, as an American, to say is, I'm thankful to the administration for what they have done on Ukraine. It's not a small thing, and I recognize that. But for them, and I think for the president, there's two topics or two interests and there's some tension between them, and certainly from a domestic political perspective, what you described makes sense. But at the NSC in the White House, there is a tension there with a fear of escalation, and right now I think it would be fair to say we don't have much of a Russia policy, and the closest thing we have to a Russia policy is our Ukraine policy.
Amen to that.
And there is a concern, and I might argue an over concern, but there is a concern about escalation, and we've seen this in this cycle, even going back before the current administration, even going back to the Obama years, about do we send javelins to Ukraine? I remember that was a question for years, where we wouldn't do that. And then we went through this cycle, with HIMARS, with tanks, now with F-16s, also kind of a policy sense, like, are we okay with Ukraine striking targets inside Russia? Do we support that? Do we not support that? Do we let Western supplied weapons be used? So we go through this cycle where things are impossible. We talk for six months, for some period of time, chew on it, decide, yeah, we can probably do that. We can send the HIMARS, we can send the Abrams, we can send the F-16s. It's not going to cause World War III to break out. And then we do it, but we do it kind of in piecemeal, and we do it only after a lot of time has been spent and arguably a lot of lives have been spent in the interim. And so I think we're still sort of stuck in this, and perhaps maybe we're working through the F-16 question now. I think the next thing is ATACMS, and I'm fully confident Ukraine will get ATACMS, and I think we're just repeating the same cycle. And and maybe also in a policy sense where we're kind of working through that same cycle of what to do with the frozen Russian state assets. So I think in the mind of the president, in the White House, there's both this domestic political context they're operating in, but also this fear of escalation and trying to find a policy line that they're comfortable with, that allows Ukraine to do the things we want Ukraine to do, but also signals or sends some message to Moscow. And so there's a couple interests there that they're juggling, and we can kind of talk about which one of those they put more emphasis on and how they make those judgments. But I think that tension sort of explains the sometimes halting or stilted policy process. I think it also kind of explains the line that I have some frustration with, that is the U.S. is with Ukraine for as long as it takes, which I think is not terribly descriptive, and I much prefer something about we're going to help Ukraine achieve victory and do it quickly and end the war quickly by winning. I think that's a much more clear and attractive policy line, and it's certainly something that we advocate for the administration to move a little closer to that kind of language as opposed to their current line.
It's like you've been here on every episode for the last year or so, because we keep repeating the same things over and over again, including the fear of escalation, including the issue about the lack of a clear definition. Lithuania is now pushing until victory. I hope this will get embraced. So then, in that vein, a twofold question focused on the Hill's support for Ukraine. The first part is there was an initiative at the beginning of the summer, a legislative initiative, at least rumors of that. I think I've seen them in the Hill and beyond, with both sides of the aisle arguing, trying to push the White House to articulate what is it that we're supporting Ukraine for, to articulate this kind of language. Do you know where we are with this, and is it worth following, pursuing into the fall and into the winter? And the second question to that is the aid packages. We've seen just today a new aid package coming out after a summer of, frankly, fear that this is about the new drawdown, essentially. And so looking into the next 12 months or so until elections, and into this dynamic that you're describing within the Republicans, but also within the Democrats and within the White House and the NSC, where do you see the flow of aid packages going? Do you see a risk of it slowing down and being reduced in quantity in US dollars over time with every month? Do you see it most likely, with the current dynamics that you're describing, being maintained throughout the next year, which would enable Ukraine to fight on, but not to victory? Or do you see actually that there's a significant chance of this rhythm increasing, depending on how much, what Dalibor was referring to, how much victory we can actually count on the Ukrainian battlefield, which of course is a very unfair equation, but unfortunately something that we're dealing with. So where do you see this going?
Two great questions. On the first question about the vision or plan for where U.S. policy is going, yes, this has been debated on Capitol Hill since the spring. We also saw it debated on the House side during the recent passage of the National Defense Authorization Act. That debate, that demand for more detail from the executive branch is definitely there. And one piece of legislation I can point you to where this is sort of being expressed is HRES 332 on the House side, a resolution titled Expressing the Sense of the House of Representatives on Ukrainian Victory, which has nearly 30 co-sponsors. And so there is a desire for more details from the executive branch. I think we all know Congress is, willing to spend money when they want to, when they understand what it's for, and what it's trying to achieve. And I think the administration has answered those questions in some ways, but not in others. And I think there is space for the administration to make that case more publicly and more clearly. On your second question about where is U.S. aid going, that's really the big question at the moment. Over August, the administration put out a supplemental request for about $24 billion for Ukraine. And right now, the Congress is coming up on the end of the fiscal year at the end of September, and there is the possibility of there being a shutdown. And so right now, over the next 3 weeks, Congress is going to work to avoid a shutdown, possibly by passing a continuing resolution. There is also a need for Congress to pass the 12 individual appropriations bills, and this was part of the debt limit deal that was agreed upon earlier this year. And if all 12 individual bills aren't passed into law by January, then there's some automatic spending cuts that come into play. So Congress has a couple big deadlines coming up. And in addition to that, there is this supplemental request that is in addition, above the top line spending numbers that were agreed to as part of the debt deal. The total package is about $40 billion, with 24 being for Ukraine. Senator Mitch McConnell has said the Senate will vote on that before the month is over. And I think the most likely scenario is probably the supplemental is attached to the CR and they're passed together as a package. But we don't know. And the next 3 weeks will be a lot of politicking, a lot of statements, a lot of negotiating to see how we get there. Because, of course, it's not only a negotiation between Congress and the White House, it's a negotiation between Senate and House Republicans, and it's also a negotiation between Republican leadership in the House, Kevin McCarthy, with the Freedom Caucus and with the more conservative wing of the House caucus. So there's a lot of competing interests and competing demands. So I'm not sure what will happen. I'm very confident support for Ukraine will continue this year and into next year. But I think it probably will become increasingly difficult, and it will be a fight. And it will be a fight, if for no other reason than this conversation will not be about Ukraine, but it will be about spending. It will be about priorities. And it will become consumed into the presidential campaign. And I think we'll probably, see some arguments around the lines of, how can you vote to spend more money on Ukraine when we haven't secured the southern border? And we'll kind of see these kind of like trade-off questions or questions of priorities. And of course, we can do both, but that's not the point. It'll be drawn into these sort of political conversations that are divorced from events in Europe and divorced from the actual, accounting reality, but will have to exist and play out in those political information bubbles. So I'm not too terribly worried looking at the future, but it will be a fight. It probably will be increasingly messy, but I do have faith in the end there are enough people of goodwill and intelligence in the executive branch on Capitol Hill that they know letting Vladimir Putin have a victory is not good. It's not good politically, and it's not good in a national security sense. And I think that is so glaringly obvious that even if it's messy and we take a really roundabout way getting there, we will still get to a place where we decide Ukrainian victory is the right choice and is good for us.
Scott, before we let you go, quick question about Razom. So I assume most of our listeners are firmly on Ukraine's side. I mean, there might still be some isolationists who have listened through the 100+ episodes out of masochism, but I think they are in the minority. So how can our listeners get in touch with Razom? What resources do you have for people who want to advocate for Ukraine's cause? And finally, how can people of goodwill help Razom or help the Ukrainian cause more broadly?
Well, thank you for that opportunity to give a little plug for Razom. I appreciate that. First and foremost, you can go to the Razom's website, rosmforukraine.org. And there on the advocacy page, we put out talking points and messaging guidelines for people who might want to call or write their member of Congress. And ROSM is also a member of the American Coalition for Ukraine, a coalition of, at this point, probably 70 plus organizations, some Ukrainian American, but not exclusively. It includes Syrian American, Persian American, Baltic American, Taiwanese American organizations who all come together to support Ukraine. And as part of that effort, we are organizing a fly-in day to Capitol Hill at the end of October 22nd through 24th. And so it's partially advocacy training, partially a mini conference to learn about Ukraine, and then a day on Capitol Hill to speak to your member of Congress about why Ukraine is important. So those who want to help virtually, please check out our website, and there's directions there to call or write member of Congress. Or if you feel like coming to Washington, D.C. in October, we'd love to have people from all over the U.S. Come and join our fly-in day and talk to a member of Congress in person about why supporting Ukraine matters to you and matters to where you live.
Scott Cullinane, thank you so much. From me, Dalibor Rohacz, and
Julia Joja.
thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast dedicated to security challenges that have erupted along the line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aei.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do get in touch with us on Twitter, or platform formerly known as Twitter, using the hashtag EasternFrontPod. And don't forget to sign up for the Eastern Front's newsletter through the link included in the show notes for more content from the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Thank you, and goodbye.